dear students. I hope that you are well and things are okay with you. And I hope that you watched the first lecture in Introduction to Literature, because today we are going to move to lecture 2 of Introduction to Literature. And I hope that if you still have any questions, write them down using my page. And use the comments to ask questions and to give me feedback about the previous lecture. Today I will pursue my discussion of language devices and sound devices that we have in poetry. Last time I tried to distinguish between prose and verse, and I focused on sound values. I told you that poetry has rhyme, rhythm, assonance, consonance, and alliteration as tools used by the poet to create harmony and music that really distinguishes poetry from prose. Now the question is poetry only distinguished by the use of sound devices, since poetry is basically different from prose in its use of rhyme and rhythm? But the answer is no. Language devices are really important in poetry as well as sound devices. So today we are going to shed some light on some of these language tools that are used by poets to communicate their meaning. For the time being, I'm going to cover simile, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, images, hyperbole, and symbol. Of course, these are not the only language devices available for us, but for the time being, in our course introduction, this is enough, and probably we will give more when we study more advanced courses in literature. But definitely we will also talk about certain language devices as the need arises during our course. The first language device is simile. But before I go into discussion of simile, I want to emphasize that language devices are important in prose as well as in verse, but in verse they acquire more importance since poems are very brief if we compare them with prose. Writing a poem is not the same as writing a short story. So language becomes a vital tool for poets to write precisely, concisely, and up to the point. First, let us discuss simile. One of the things that we might analyze as we deal with the language of poems is simile. The word simile, S-I-M-I-L-E, reminds us of the adjective similar. So what are the two things which are similar in a simile? A simile means that I liken something to something else. It's a form of comparison between two things. When I say Ali is like a lion, I am using a simile. So what I am doing is likening Ali to a lion. Now the question is, why is Ali likened to a lion? Is Ali an animal, for example? Does he roar? Does he walk on four? This sounds funny, right? Actually, we just borrowed one aspect of the lion, which is courage, bravery, and strength, and we attributed it to Ali. So a simile basically consists of three components or elements. There is the tenor, which is in our example Ali, and there is the vehicle, which is in our example the lion, and there is the tool that we used here to compare between Ali and the lion, which is like. So what do we call like? We call it an indicator of resemblance, an indicator of resemblance. For example, in Richard Burns's poem, A Red, Red Rose, the poet says, "My love is like a red, red rose." So the poet likens his beloved lady to a red, red rose. Now, does his beloved lady have thorns? Does she have roots and leaves? Again, this is funny. Of course she doesn't. But why does he compare her to a rose? He borrowed one aspect of the vehicle, which is the rose, and he attributed it to the vehicle, who is the beloved lady. So in a simile, we are saying that two things are similar. And notice here that the two things should be of different natures. So when I say, my car is like your car, this is not a simile, because car and car are two things which are of the same nature. So this is not a simile. A simile is between two things of two different natures, and we borrow one aspect of the vehicle and we attribute it to the tenor. So this is a simile. For example, we have Shakespeare's simile. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thee is a reference to the beloved lady, and a summer's day is the vehicle. So the tenor is thee, who is the beloved lady, and the vehicle is summer's day. Now, where is the indicator? The indicator is the word compare. So a simile is a form of comparison between two things of two different natures. And often we use similes in literature or in poetry as we use them also in real life. In real life, we have plenty of examples where we try to illustrate things by using similes. Like when we say he was as white as a sheet, we are comparing between a person and a sheet. I am as hungry as a bear. I am comparing between myself and the bear in the aspect of hunger. As busy as a bee is also a form of simile. So indicators could be compare, could be than, could be like, or resemble. And of course, as we study poems, we are going to cite some examples of simile. Okay. Number two, another figure of speech is metaphor. And metaphor is similar to simile in the fact that we have tenor and vehicle, but different from the simile because we don't have an indicator. So in the first example that we studied about simile, when we said Ali is like a lion, in a metaphor it becomes Ali is a lion. In the second example, my love is like a red, red rose, it becomes my love is a red rose. So what did we do? We just omitted the indicator of resemblance. So the English poet who says, my love is like fever, he is likening his beloved lady to fever, and there is no indicator of resemblance. So the tenor and the vehicle are not similar like the simile, they are identical. And because they are identical, we omit the indicator of resemblance. In a metaphor, you can have tenor and vehicle, and sometimes you can omit the vehicle and you mention something associated with the vehicle. So let us take, for example, Emily Dickinson's poem, when she says, hope is the thing with feathers. When she says hope is the thing with feathers, she doesn't mention the word bird, but she says thing with feathers. So here feathers remind us of the bird. So Emily Dickinson is saying that hope is a bird without an indicator of resemblance. Now let us take another example. There is a poet who says, slowly, silently, now the moon walks the night in her silver shoon. Now, the poet says that the moon walks the night in her silver shoon. So did he say that the moon is a human being? What do you think? Actually, yes, because he used walk and he used hair. So he is likening the moon to a woman who wears silver shoes and she walks the night in them and she turns everything into silver. And this form of metaphor, where the vehicle is always a human being, I mean, the vehicle is always fixed and it's always a human being, we call this personification. So personification is a kind of metaphor where the vehicle is always a human being. When you say the moon walks, of course the moon doesn't walk, so you are attributing a human equality to the moon. So whenever you attribute a human equality or sensibility to a thing or an animal, then you are using personification. There is also a poet, I think he says that in one of his Italian sonnets. He says something again about the moon. He says, with how sad steps, O moon, thou climbest the skies. With how sad steps, O moon, thou climbest the skies. Now here the writer doesn't mention the word human being, but he mentioned that the moon has sad steps. And if we go to the poem, we notice also that he speaks about the moon having a wan, or let us call it a pale face. Well, definitely the moon doesn't have a face. So giving this quality to the moon means that the poet personified the moon as a human being who has a pale face and who has sad steps. So a special form of metaphor is what we call personification. A special form of metaphor is what we call personification. The difference is, in a personification example, the tenor can vary, but the vehicle is fixed. The vehicle is a human being. Now, if the poet uses a metaphor and then he continues to use it from the beginning of the poem till the end of the poem, then this metaphor becomes what we call an extended metaphor. An extended metaphor. But if the writer mentions the tenor and does not mention the vehicle, but mentions something associated with it, like in the example of the moon, the thing which is associated with the human being is walking, sadness, and also having a pale face. These qualities are related to the human being, but the word human being is not mentioned. So if the vehicle is hinted at but not explicitly stated, then we describe the metaphor as an implied metaphor. We describe it as an implied metaphor. Number 3, another language device which is significant in poetry is metonymy. If you just go to any handbook in literature or any book that defines figures of speech and you look the word metonymy up, you will notice that the simplest definition is that metonymy is an act of substitution. It's an act of substitution. You substitute something for another. Is this only in literature and poetry? Well, the answer is no. Our life is full of examples of metonymy. Okay, since life is full, let us cite some of these examples. Probably when you listen to the news, you might get an example like Cairo declared, or the White House stated. Well, does Cairo declare or does the White House state? Actually, we mean the people in the White House. The people in Cairo, probably the president in the United States, or the president in Cairo. So here what we mean is something residential. The relationship here is residential. Also, when you speak about metonymy, you might say he drank a bottle of cola, or he drank a glass of juice. He ate a plate of rice. When you think of these examples, does it mean that people swallow the glass or swallow the plate? No, actually the thing is, we are talking about the container relationship. So we didn't swallow the glass, we drank what is inside the glass. We did not eat the plate, but so this kind of relationship is what we call contained relationship, or container relationship. So we don't mean that we swallow the bottle or we eat the plate, we eat what is served in them. Another example of metonymy is when we say the British throne. The British throne announced. Or when we say something like the crown announced. Now we don't mean the crown, we mean the prince. We mean the king or the queen of the country, because the crown or the throne are related to royalty. They are related to monarchs. Another thing that is also considered a kind of metonymy that we find in real life is when we say with the sweat of my face, or with the sweat of my brow. A sweat here is metonymic of what? It's metonymic of hard labor. So metonymy is available as a tool, not only for everyday speech, but it's also available for writers and poets in specific. Now let us take some examples from literature, the use of metonymy in literature. For example, we have in the Bible, for example, we notice that there is a verse which says, "With the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread." The sweat of the face is metonymic of hard labor. In Macbeth, for example, Shakespeare says, "This is my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red." Shakespeare here says that he will turn the color of the sea from green into red. Of course, Shakespeare is not the speaker, but Macbeth was the one. Now, what's the meaning of turning the color of sea from green into red? This is metonymic of killing. This is metonymic of killing. So if the color of the sea turns into red, this is metonymic of killing. However, another form of metonymy, or a subcategory of metonymy, is synecdoche. Synecdoche. Synecdoche is a form of metonymy, but synecdoche is substitution of the part for the whole, or the whole for the part. First, let me start by reminding you of examples of synecdoche that we use in everyday life. You might hear an example like, 5 souls were lost in the accident. 5 souls were lost in the accident. Now, what is meant by souls? Do we mean just the soul or the human being as a whole? Actually, we mean that 5 people were killed, but we didn't mention people or persons. We mentioned souls. Another example could be like, he has 8 hungry mouths to feed. 8 hungry mouths to feed. Now, does the head of the family have mouths or children? Actually, children. But the mouth was mentioned, and it substitutes the children. When we say lend me a helping hand, the hand is not supposed to provide help away from the body. So we mention the hand and we mean the human being. In the previous example that I quoted from Macbeth, when he said, "This is my hand, will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine." This is my hand. Can the hand kill away from the body? No. So he mentioned the hand and he means himself as a whole. When Shakespeare also says, when you read this line, remember the hand that wrote it. I am paraphrasing. The hand that wrote it. Again, he mentioned the hand and he means the whole. Also, when Wordsworth speaks about Milton and he says, "Thou hadst a voice like the sea," he mentions the voice and he means the human being as a whole. So synecdoche is an act of substitution. You mention the whole and you mean the part, or you mention the part and you mean the whole. Now I gave you examples of mentioning the part and meaning the whole, but let me give you an example of mentioning the whole and you mean the part. If you read something and someone says to you, "Where did you get that from?" and you say, "It's all over mass media." It's all over mass media. Probably you just read it by reading just one newspaper, but you say all over mass media. When you read something from Facebook and you say it's all over social networks, you mean Facebook, but you mentioned the social network sites. So here you mention the whole and you mean the part. These are some of the language tools used by the poet. So so far I have discussed simile, metaphor, metonymy, and synecdoche. Please feel free to write your comments under the video, and please ask any question you feel you need. Okay, now let me talk about hyperbole. 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 Probably you remember the prefix hyper, which means like hypertension, hyperactive, hypersensitive. Hyper means more than what is needed. It's more than what you expect. So if the child is hyperactive, his activity is exaggerated. So what's the meaning of hyperbole in literature? By definition, hyperbole means conscious exaggeration. Conscious exaggeration. When you are exaggerating and you are aware of the fact that you are exaggerating. So why are you exaggerating? Can you guess? Actually, we exaggerate because we want to communicate a message. Again, in real life, we have a lot of examples. When you wait for your friends and you tell them, "I have been here for 3 hours." Probably they were not 3 hours, they were just a couple of minutes or 10 minutes. So you are exaggerating to communicate a message that you felt tired or probably bored from waiting. When you say to your kids, "I told you this 1,000,000 times," definitely you didn't do that 1,000,000 times, but you are exaggerating. In poetry, for example, in John Donne's poem, when he says, "Go and catch a falling star." Of course, no one can go and catch a falling star. So what does the poet mean to say? He means to say that even if you do the impossible, this thing is not going to be true. Also, when Shakespeare says, making the green one red, in the previous example that I cited as a good example of metonymy, actually, no matter how many people will be killed, the color of the sea will never turn into red. A poet who describes the beauty of his beloved's hair says, "Blind with thine hair the eye of the sun." Blind with thine hair the eye of the sun. No matter how yellow the hair of the beloved lady, it will never blind the eye of the sun. Again, this is exaggeration. Of course, we're going to cite a lot of examples as we read poems in our course, but this is just an introduction about some of the language tools that poets can use to communicate their meaning. Because, as I said, language devices are vital for poets. Another language device that we need in poetry is the image. Well, I'm aware of the fact that modern technology really mixes between the concept of the picture and the image, because right now people speak of their images using mobile phones, etc. But I am going to use image in its precise meaning as a term which is different from the word picture. Because picture is something that I can see. It is something that I can touch. But the image is a mental picture. The image is a mental picture, which means that it's an image that is formed in the mind of the reader. It's no coincidence that image resonates with imagination. So image reminds us of imagination. So an image in literature is a mental picture which is portrayed or drawn by using words. Words are the tools. It's not the brush of the painter, it's the language that is used in order to draw an image. One of the important things in poetry is the poet's ability to draw images. It's the poet's ability to draw images and to make them clear to the readers, as if they were looking through an open window. Definitely the skill of the poet in drawing images is something that testifies to his or her skill. Now, how can we understand images in poetry? Actually, we have first to understand the meaning of image. Number two, we have to understand the types of images that we have in literature. For the time being, I'm going to give you a number of these types, but not all of them. The first and the most famous type of image is what we call the visual image. Number two, the tactile image. Number three, the olfactory image. Number four, the gustatory image. The fifth type is what we call the oral or the auditory image. The auditory image. So let us start by mentioning the first type, visual. Visual actually reminds us of vision. Vision. So something which is visual is something which is perceived by using our eyes. So the visual image is an image that can be realized by looking at it, by using the ability to see. So if the poet is portraying a visual image, what he does is just to help you imagine that you see something. When the poet describes a flower or a field full of grass, and we can imagine that we see this in reality, then we have been able to understand the visual image that has been communicated by the poet. So in a line of poetry like "It's a beauteous evening, calm and free," what we need to do is just to imagine that we see the evening as a beautiful scene. We are not required to do anything, just to imagine that we see the evening. It's like when I tell you right now to close your eyes and to imagine that you are on the beach and you are walking and you are enjoying the breeze. So what you need to do is just to imagine that you are there and you are enjoying your time. You are not required to do anything else. The second type of image is what we call the auditory or the oral image. And auditory or oral is using the ears. We are just supposed to imagine that we can hear something. Like when I say to you, just close your eyes and imagine you are near the beach and you could hear the murmuring water. Or you can listen to the sound of the waves as they hit the beach. Or I want you to imagine that it's raining heavily and you could hear the tapping of the rainy drops on your window. So what's your task here? It is just to imagine that you could hear the sound of rain. This is what we call oral or auditory image. And oral is A-U-R-A-L, oral. A third form of image or type, let me say, is the tactile image. And the tactile image is something that relates to our ability to touch, to touch things, Like when you describe something as smooth, rough, harsh, etc. What are you supposed to do as a reader? Just to imagine that you touch something. Like I say now, close your eyes and imagine that you are touching the petals of a flower. Or I want you to pass your palm on needles. Can you imagine that? Now, tactile is related to this, your ability to touch something. The third type of images is what we call the olfactory image. The olfactory image. And this is O-L-F-A-C-T-O-R-Y, olfactory. And olfactory is related to our ability to smell using our noses, of course. Now I can tell you to imagine that you smell your favorite dish. Imagine that you are at home and you can smell your favorite dish. You can smell ملوخية. You can smell مقلوبة. So these are your favorite dishes and you can smell them. What you need to do is just to imagine. Imagine that you smell jasmines or you smell roses. What you need to do is just to imagine. Gustatory images are related to your ability to taste something. When you have words like bitter or sour or sweet in poetry, you're talking about what? You are talking about the taste of these things. So what's the role of the poet? The role of the poet is to make you imagine that you could taste such things. So these are the 5 types of images that we talked about. So later on, as we study poems, we are going to analyze them using these language tools. Finally, I want to remind you of the symbol. In our study of short stories, as I am sure you still remember, we mentioned some important symbols in the stories. We mentioned leather and shoes in Galsworthy's story, Quality. We mentioned the fur in Miss Brill's story, the fur of Miss Brill. We also mentioned the bazaar in Arabi. So we noticed that symbols are important aspects of writing and specifically literature, and I think they gain more importance when we speak about poetry. So this is just a reminder that the symbol is something that stands for itself and yet represents something else. So the symbol has physical existence and it has a kind of suggestive quality or aspect. So in poetry as well as in prose, we need to understand the meaning of symbol. So poets can always conceive certain objects or images with symbolism, and this symbol occurs more than one time in a poem, so it becomes a symbol. So symbols are things that stand for themselves and they represent something else. Symbols can be taken from real life and they can be taken from the imagination of the poet. The poet can use symbols which are available in real life, like all over literature and real life. The sun is a symbol of freedom. The sea is a symbol of life. The sun is a symbol of warmth and life. So these symbols are available for the poet, but the poet can create his own symbol in literature. A symbol can be created by the poet to mean something in a certain literary work, but outside the literary work, the symbol might not be the same. So when we speak, for example, of Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, and Shakespeare speaks of a summer's day, definitely a summer's day in the mind of Shakespeare, as he made it very clear in the poem, is a symbol of beauty, maturity, life, and vitality. Also, in Shakespeare, we notice that autumn is a symbol of old age, a symbol of probably life which is about to end. It's a symbol of old age, etc. So in general, symbols are employed by poets to communicate certain ideas. Here we come to the end of our second lecture in Introduction to Literature. I want you to read the first poem in our book, which is My Last Duchess. We are going to study this poem as an example of what we call dramatic monologue. I hope that you read the poem and you shall be ready for our discussion next time. Thank you very much. Keep safe.